The completion of the library wall had brought a temporary stillness to the western slope, but Elder Julian was not a man built for long periods of inactivity. For a mason, the end of one project is simply the foundation for the next, and the Abbey was a living organism that always required the attention of the stone. After a week of heavy rain that had settled the new wall into the mountain, Julian received word from the abbot that the old well near the Eastern Cloister had begun to fail. The timber lining of the shaft, which had been placed nearly a century ago, was finally surrendering to the constant moisture and the pressure of the earth. The task was clear, and it was formidable. Julian was to replace the wood with a permanent lining of dry stone and build a protective well house above it to ensure the purity of the water for the generations to come. He began the first day by standing at the edge of the old well, and he felt the immense and cooling presence of the water far below. The air in the cloister was different from the air on the western slope. It was trapped within the high stone arches and the thick ivy, and it carried the scent of wet slate and old incense, and the cold mineral tang of the deep earth. Julian knelt on the damp grass, and he placed his hands on the rim of the well. He felt the vibration of the Abbey around him, a steady and reliable pulse that spoke of the continuity of the monastic life. The water was the lifeblood of the community, and to work on the well was to work on the very heart of the Abbey. The first ritual of the new project was the clearing of the circle. Julian took a long length of hemp rope and a heavy iron spike, and he began to map out the footprint of the well house. He drove the spike into the center of the old well, and he used the rope as a compass to draw a perfect circle in the dark and fertile soil. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his breath was a low and constant sound in the silence of the cloister. He was not just marking the ground, he was establishing the boundary of the sacred space. The circle was the symbol of the eternal and the unbroken, and it was the only shape that could truly withstand the pressure of the mountain. Once the circle was drawn, Julian began the excavation. He used a short-handled spade to remove the top layer of the turf, and he worked with a meticulous care to preserve the roots of the nearby ivy. The soil was rich and black, and it smelled of ancient things, of decayed leaves, and the slow transformation of the mineral world. As he dug deeper, he encountered the first of the old timbers. They were dark and heavy with the moisture of 100 years, and they crumbled under the touch of his hands like old bread. Julian removed the rotted wood with a sense of quiet reverence. It had served its purpose, and it had protected the water for a lifetime, and now it was returning to the earth to make room for the stone. By the time the sun had reached its zenith, Julian had cleared the first 5 feet of the shaft. The walls of the excavation were raw and damp, and they revealed the different layers of the mountain's history. He saw the red clay of the upper slope, and the dark veins of the coal, and the gray grit of the limestone. He felt the temperature of the earth dropping as he moved deeper, and the air became thick with the scent of the deep minerals. He was no longer a figure of the light. He was a participant in the darkness of the foundation. He looked up at the circle of the sky above him, and he saw the white clouds moving across the blue void like silent ships. The world was vast and open, but here in the earth there was only the stillness and the weight. He began the process of the shoring. Before he could place the first of the lining stones, he had to ensure that the walls of the shaft would not collapse under their own pressure. He used a series of heavy oak planks to create a temporary frame, and he wedged them into place using small blocks of granite. He worked with a precision that left no room for error. A single shift in the soil could lead to a breach, and the well would be lost to the mountain. Julian listened to the sound of the earth as he worked. He heard the small trickles of moisture, and the soft rustle of the grit, and the low and heavy groan of the mountain as it adjusted to the new void. He was the listener of the stone, and he understood the language of the pressure. He placed the stone against the wall of the shaft, and he felt the subtle resistance of the earth. In a dry stone well there is no mortar to glue the pieces together, and there is no iron to hold the structure firm. The masonry relies entirely on the honesty of the weight and the perfect marriage of the shapes. Julian turned the basalt stone over in his hands, and he felt for the bed. He positioned the stone so that it overlapped the joint of the 2 stones below it, creating a bond that would lock the courses together. He used a small wooden mallet to tap the stone into place, and the sound was a short and heavy report that echoed off the clay walls. He did not rush the movement. He waited until he felt the stone settle into the embrace of the circle. The work in the narrow shaft was a meditation on the limit of space. Julian had to keep his movements compact and his focus sharp, as there was no room for error or for wasted energy. He felt the pull in his shoulders and the steady ache in his core as he moved from stone to stone, and his breath was a low and constant sound in the silence. The dust from the basalt was a fine and dark powder that coated his hands and turned the skin of his forearms into a map of the mountain's history. He looked at his knuckles and his palms, and he saw the way the grit had settled into the deep lines of his skin. He was a man of the earth, and he was becoming a part of the structure he was building. As the second and third courses began to rise, the scale of the task became clear. Julian was not just lining a well. He was building a vertical foundation for the water of the Abbey. He had to consider the batter of the lining, which was the subtle inward lean that would ensure the stones were constantly pressing toward the center of the circle. If the walls were perfectly vertical, the pressure of the earth would eventually push them inward and the well would collapse. But a wall with a true batter uses the weight of the mountain as a source of strength. Julian used a short plumb line to check the angle of every course, and he adjusted the shims with a quiet and meticulous care. He found a section of the shaft where the clay was particularly soft, and the water from the previous night's rain had created a pocket of mud. This was a point of danger for the masonry, as the soil could shift and create a void behind the stones. Julian did not ignore the flaw. He took a handful of small and jagged flint chips, and he began to pack them into the soft earth. He used his mallet to drive the flint deep into the clay, creating a solid and unyielding hearting that would support the basalt. He worked with a patient and focused intensity, and he felt the resonance of the mountain through the tools. He was the listener of the pressure, and he understood that the silence of the earth was never empty. By the time the fourth course was complete, the sun had reached the center of the sky, and the light was pouring directly into the well. The basalt glowed with a dull and honest light, and the red clay looked like a vibrant and ancient tapestry. Julian sat back on his heels, and he took a slow and measured drink of water from his skin. The water was cold, and it tasted of the mountain, and it gave him a sense of renewal and strength. He looked at the circle he had built, and he felt a deep sense of connection to the builders who had come before him. They had stood in this same earth, and they had handled these same stones, and they had felt the same weight in their bones. He was a part of a long and unbroken line of masters who understood that the only way to build for the future was to respect the past. He reached for the next bucket of stones, and he began the process of the fifth course. The stones were getting larger now as he moved closer to the water table where the pressure of the earth was at its greatest. He selected a massive binder of dark basalt, and he felt the immense weight of the mineral as he lifted it from the bucket. He had to use his entire body to guide the stone into position, and he felt the strain in his legs and his lower back. He placed the binder across the joint, and he felt the finality of the placement. The stone was home. It was a bridge of weight that would hold the lining firm for 100 years. The first of the lining stones were brought to the cloister on the ash sledge. They were small and flat pieces of dark basalt, each one selected for its density and its resistance to the water. Julian took the first stone and he lowered it into the shaft using a simple rope harness. He followed the stone down, and he knelt in the cool and dark center of the well. He felt the dampness of the earth through the fabric of his robes, and the sting of the cold air on his skin. He placed the basalt stone against the wall of the shaft, and he felt the weight of the mountain pressing against his back. This was the moment of the first ring. The point where the stone began to reclaim the void and the well began to find its permanent form. He worked in a slow and rhythmic circle, and his hands moved with the grace of a man who was weaving a tapestry of the earth. He did not use mortar to hold the lining stones in place. He relied on the arch effect, the natural pressure of the circle that turned every stone into a binder for its neighbor. He placed the stones with the bed facing outwards so that the weight of the mountain would only serve to tighten the bond. He used small slivers of slate to shim the joints, and he felt the grit against his skin as a final blessing of the masonry. The ring began to rise inch by inch, a dark and unyielding ridge of volcanic rock in the middle of the red clay. The physical toll of the work in the shaft was different from the labor on the terrace. There was no room for the long swing of the hammer or the full extension of the arms. The movements were compact and intense, and they required a high level of concentration and balance. Julian felt the pull in his core and the steady ache in his knees, and he welcomed the intimacy of the task. He was in the heart of the Abbey, and he was touching the very source of its life. He thought about the water that would eventually flow through this stone, and he felt a deep sense of connection to the future. The well would stand long after the library wall was gone, and it would provide the refreshment for the brothers of the next century. As the first ring was completed, the light in the cloister began to turn into a deep and vibrant gold. The sun was beginning its descent, and the shadows of the arches were stretching across the grass like long and dark fingers. Julian stood in the center of the well, and he looked at the work of the day. The basalt was dark and silent, and it carried the vibration of the mountain within its grain. The circle was true, and the bond was solid, and the foundation of the well was set. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction in the ritual. He had taken the first step toward the restoration of the heart, and he had established the boundary of the deep silence. He climbed out of the shaft, and he stood on the damp grass for a long moment, simply being present in the stillness of the cloister. The wind had died down, and the air was perfectly still, and the only sound was the distant tolling of the evening bell. Julian looked at the circle he had drawn in the earth, and he saw the promise of the well house. It would be a structure of beauty and strength, a monument to the patience of the stone and the permanence of the Abbey. He felt the fatigue in his joints, but it was a quiet and satisfying tiredness. He was the mason of the mountain's bone, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. The morning returned with a heavy and silver light that seemed to cling to the high arches of the Eastern Cloister. Elder Julian stood at the rim of the well, and he looked down into the dark and narrow throat of the earth. The first ring of basalt was settled and firm, and the volcanic rock looked like a dark and silent crown resting in the red clay. But a single ring was only a promise of stability, and the true strength of the well lay in the repetition of the circle. To build a lining that would withstand the pressure of the mountain for centuries, Julian had to ensure that every stone was a part of a singular and unyielding arch. He gathered his leather harness and his heavy hemp ropes, and he prepared for the descent into the deep silence once more. He lowered himself into the shaft with a slow and rhythmic motion, and his boots found purchase on the narrow ledge of the basalt. The air in the well was cold, and it carried the scent of wet minerals and ancient water and the heavy smell of the undisturbed earth. Julian knelt in the center of the circle, and he felt the immense and grounding presence of the mountain all around him. He was a figure of the shadows now, and the light from the sky above was a small and distant disk of white. He reached for the first stone of the second course, which had been lowered down to him in a canvas bucket. It was a flat and heavy piece of basalt, its surface rough and pitted by the volcanic fires of the past. The shadows in the shaft began to lengthen as the afternoon sun moved toward the western peaks. Julian continued the work with a rhythmic and steady pace, and his hands moved with the grace of a man who was weaving the very fabric of the earth. He reached the point in the excavation where the red clay gave way to the gray grit of the limestone, and he felt the temperature of the air drop even further. He was nearing the aquifer, the source of the lifeblood of the Abbey. He could hear the faint and distant sound of the water moving through the rock, a soft and rushing whisper that spoke of the deep silence. He felt a quiet spark of satisfaction in his chest. The well was rising, and the heart of the Abbey was being restored. He stopped the work for a moment to look up at the circle of the sky. The first stars were beginning to appear in the blue void, and the air was cooling rapidly. He felt the fatigue in his joints and the heavy ache in his muscles, but it was a good and honest tiredness. He had built 5 courses of the lining, and the circle was true, and the bond was solid. He was the mason of the mountain's bone, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. He began the slow climb out of the shaft, and he felt the relief of the open air and the wide horizon. He stood on the damp grass of the cloister, and he looked at the well, and he felt the presence of the stone. The wind had died down, and the air was perfectly still, and the only sound was the distant tolling of the evening bell. Julian gathered his tools, and he cleaned them with a dry cloth, and he felt the smooth and polished surface of the wood, and the cold and hard edge of the steel. He was ready for the rest of the night, and the simplicity of the evening meal. He was ready for the silence. He took a final look at the well, and he reached out to touch the cold rim of the basalt. He felt the vibration of the mountain still lingering in the grain, and he felt the steady and reliable pulse of the earth. The work was not finished, but the foundation was secure and the masonry was true. He walked toward the Abbey entrance, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk. He was the mason, and the mountain was his master, and in the center of the stone he found his ultimate peace. He thought about the stones that were yet to be laid and the well house that was yet to be built, and he felt a deep sense of purpose. The Abbey was a living entity, and he was the one who ensured its stability and its permanence. He was the keeper of the foundation, and he was the listener of the stone. And in that quietude he moved toward the rest. The air at the bottom of the shaft was no longer just cold, it was heavy with the moisture of the deep mountain. The red clay had given way to a layer of gray silt and fine gravel, and the sound of the world above had been replaced by the rhythmic and insistent seep of the aquifer. Elder Julian stood at the very base of the excavation, and he felt the water as it began to pool around the soles of his heavy leather boots. It was not a sudden flood but a slow and patient arrival, as if the mountain were finally allowing its secret lifeblood to be seen by the light of the man. The water was cold, and it carried a sharp mineral tang that spoke of its long journey through the limestone, and the flint, and the deep veins of the mountain bone. Julian closed his eyes for a moment, and he listened to the voice of the spring. It was a low and constant whisper, a sound of movement and life that had been hidden in the darkness for an eternity. He began the process of the filter course. This was the most technical and sensitive part of the well lining, for it was here that the masonry had to be both a wall and a gate. He reached for the first of the filter stones, which he had sorted into a separate pile on the cloister grass. These were not the dark basalt blocks he used for the upper lining, but small and polished river stones he had gathered from the bed of the Abbey stream during the dry months of the previous summer. Every stone was smoothed and rounded by the passage of time, and they were entirely free of the fine grit and the clay that could cloud the purity of the well. Julian knelt in the cold pool, and he began to lay the first course of the bed. He moved with a quiet and focused intensity, and his hands were dark and powerful against the silver surface of the rising water. He placed the river stones in a thick and interlocking layer across the floor of the shaft. He was creating a porous foundation that would allow the water to rise through the gaps while keeping the heavy mountain soil from clogging the intake. He did not use his hammer for this task. He used only his hands, feeling for the way the smooth surfaces of the stones could be wedged together to create a stable and unyielding floor. The water moved around his fingers, and it carried away the final traces of the red clay from his skin. He looked at his knuckles and his palms, and he saw the way the moisture made his skin gleam like the wet granite of the high quarry. He felt a deep sense of connection to the element. The water was not an obstacle to be overcome. It was a companion in the labor. Once the filter bed was settled, Julian began the first course of the intake wall. This required a specific kind of masonry that he called the gapped bond. Every 3 stones of basalt he left a small and deliberate void, a precise gap that would serve as a gateway for the rising spring. These were the weep holes, and they were the secret of a healthy and lasting well. Julian adjusted the placement of the basalt with a meticulous care, ensuring that the gaps were large enough to allow the flow of the water but small enough to prevent the silt of the mountain from entering the shaft. He used tiny slivers of slate as shims to maintain the spacing, and he felt the grit of the stone against his skin as a final blessing of the work. As the first course of the intake wall was completed, he felt the pressure of the water beginning to equalize. The pool around his boots was now nearly 4 inches deep, and the sound of the seep had changed from a whisper to a steady and rhythmic gurgle. Julian watched as the water flowed through the weep holes, and he saw the way it carried the silver light of the sky down into the darkness. He thought about the concept of the bridge. The well was a bridge between the world of the light and the world of the deep silence, and the weep holes were the doors that allowed the transition to happen. He felt a quiet spark of satisfaction in his chest. The masonry was true, and the bond was solid, and the water was finding its way home. The second and third courses of the intake wall required larger and heavier binders of dark basalt to ensure that the pressure of the aquifer would not push the lining inward. Julian reached for the heavy rope, and he signaled to the brothers above to lower the next bucket of stone. He felt the vibration of the pulling, and he watched as the massive binders descended through the narrow circle of the sky. He caught the first of the stones, and he felt the immense weight of the volcanic rock as it settled into his arms. He was working in a space that was now entirely wet, and the stone was slick and cold in his grip. He braced his legs against the walls of the shaft, and he guided the binder into its position over the weak holes of the first course. The physical toll of the work in the water was immense. The cold of the pool was beginning to seep through the leather of his boots, and the dampness of the air was settling into his robes. Julian did not allow the discomfort to distract him. He focused on the rhythm of the masonry, and the steady flow of his own breath. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and his body was the anchor of the project. He felt the pull in his core and the heavy ache in his shoulders, and he welcomed the fatigue. It was the price of the restoration. He was giving his own strength to the earth, and in return the earth was giving him the gift of the water. He placed the second binder, and he felt the finality of the placement. The ring of the intake was rising, and the well was becoming a singular and unyielding entity. By the time the fourth course of the intake wall was complete, the sun had moved to a position where it was no longer shining directly into the shaft. The light was soft and blue, and it cast long and liquid shadows across the basalt masonry. Julian sat back on his heels in the cold water, and he allowed himself a moment of stillness. He looked at the circle he had built, and he saw the way the stones were beginning to disappear beneath the surface of the rising pool. The water was now nearly a foot deep, and it was clear and pure and filled with the memory of the mountain. He reached down, and he scooped a handful of the water to his lips. It was the coldest and cleanest thing he had ever tasted, and it carried the essence of the deep minerals and the ancient silences. He thought about the centuries of rain that had fallen on the high quarry, and the way the moisture had traveled through the limestone and the flint to reach this point. Every drop was a traveler, and every drop was a part of the history of the Abbey. Julian felt a profound sense of reverence for the cycle. He was not just building a well, he was participating in the eternal movement of the earth. He was the one who provided the vessel for the water, and the water was the one that gave life to the vessel. He felt a deep sense of peace in the knowledge that the well would remain long after his own name was forgotten. It was a monument to the patience of the stone and the permanence of the spring. The evening bell began to toll from the high tower of the Abbey, and the sound traveled down the shaft as a series of low and resonant vibrations. Julian gathered his tools, and he prepared for the final climb of the day. He looked at the intake wall, and he saw the way the weak holes were performing their silent duty. The water was rising steadily, and the silt was being held back by the filter bed, and the spirit of the well was true. He felt a quiet sense of triumph. The most difficult part of the restoration was complete, and the foundation of the heart was secure. He climbed out of the shaft, and he stood on the damp grass of the cloister, feeling the warmth of the evening air against his skin. He took a final look at the circle in the earth, and he saw the silver reflection of the first stars in the water below. The mountain was at rest, and the stones were still, and the spring was finding its way to the surface. Julian was tired, and his robes were stained with the red clay and the dark dust of the basalt, but he was satisfied. He was the keeper of the foundation, and he had done his duty. He walked toward the Abbey entrance, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk. He was leaving the well in the hands of the night, and he knew that the stones were ready for the rise. The water at the bottom of the well was no longer a shallow pool, but a steady and rising presence that reflected the small circle of the sky far above. Elder Julian stood on the narrow ledge of the intake wall, and he felt the immense and cooling weight of the mountain pressing against the outside of the basalt lining. He was now transitioning from the porous filter section to the solid structural shaft, and the work required a shift in both his rhythm and his focus. Every stone he placed now had to be a perfect seal against the red clay and the shifting silt of the mountain side. He reached for the heavy hemp rope that dangled in the center of the well, and he felt the vibration of the pulley as the next bucket of masonry was lowered into the darkness. The stones for the middle shaft were a dense and gray limestone which Julian had selected for their strength and their ability to lock together in a tight and unyielding embrace. He took the first of the limestone blocks from the bucket, and he felt the cold and slightly chalky texture of the mineral against his dark palms. The stone was heavy and solid, and it carried the scent of the high quarry and the memory of the sun. Julian knelt on the wet basalt, and he began the process of the second bond. He placed the limestone over the joint of the intake binders, and he felt for the bed of the masonry. He was looking for the point where the stone would sit perfectly flush without the need for a shim or a wedge. He moved with a quiet and deliberate intensity, and his breath was a slow and rhythmic cadence in the silence of the shaft. The air in the well was thick with the smell of wet minerals and old earth, and the sound of the rising water was a constant and comforting whisper. Julian used a heavy iron hammer to tap the limestone into place, and the sound was a deep and resonant report that traveled up through the shaft and out into the cloister. He did not strike with his whole arm. He moved from the wrist and the elbow, keeping his movements compact and efficient in the narrow space. He was the listener of the stone, and he understood the way the vibration changed when the bond was true. As the first course of the limestone lining began to take shape, Julian felt the shift in the pressure. The wall was no longer a separate collection of rocks. It was becoming a singular and organic entity. He worked in a slow and rhythmic circle, and his hands moved with the grace of a man who was weaving the very fabric of the mountain. He ensured that the batter of the lining was consistent, using his short plumb line to check the inward leaning of every stone. The circle was the strongest shape in the world, and Julian treated it with a quiet and profound reverence. He was not just building a lining for a well, he was participating in the eternal geometry of the earth. One of the most critical aspects of the shaft masonry was the backfill ritual. As the limestone lining rose, Julian had to fill the gap between the stone and the raw earth of the excavation. He used a mixture of small river pebbles and coarse mountain sand to create a drainage layer that would allow the moisture to flow down to the intake without putting undue pressure on the wall. He reached for a separate bucket of the fill, and he began to pour the pebbles into the void behind the limestone. The sound was a bright and crystalline rattle, a chorus of mineral voices finding their places in the darkness. He used a long wooden rammer to pack the backfill down, and he felt the vibration of the impact in the marrow of his bones. He was ensuring that there were no air pockets and no hidden voids where the frost could take root. The backfill was the secret strength of the well. It was the cushion that protected the masonry from the movement of the mountain, and the anchor that held the circle in place. Julian worked with a meticulous care, and his hands were dark and textured against the pale gray of the limestone. He looked at the way the grit and the dust had settled into the fine lines of his skin, and he felt a deep sense of pride in the labor. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and his work was the bridge between the world of the light and the world of the deep silence. By the time the third course of the limestone was complete, the light in the well had begun to turn into a soft and emerald green. The sun was moving across the sky, and the reflections of the ivy from the cloister arches were dancing on the surface of the water. Julian sat back on his heels, and he allowed himself a moment of stillness. He looked at the circle he had built, and he saw the way the stones were beginning to glow with an internal light. The well was no longer a dark and frightening void. It was a sanctuary of sound and stone. He reached down, and he touched the surface of the rising pool, and he felt the cool and silver energy of the spring. The water was clear and pure, and it was a testament to the honesty of the masonry. The fourth and fifth courses of the shaft required the placement of the key binders. These were massive and long pieces of limestone that were intended to span the entire width of the lining and lock into the surrounding earth. They were the anchors of the shaft, and they required an immense amount of physical strength and technical precision to place. Julian signaled to the brothers above, and he watched as the first of the binders descended through the narrow circle of the sky. The stone was nearly 3 feet long, and it moved with a slow and majestic grace, and it looked like a silver cloud in the center of the darkness. Julian caught the binder, and he felt the strain in his shoulders and his core as he guided the weight into position. He had to brace his legs against the walls of the shaft, and use the strength of his entire body to maneuver the stone. He placed the binder across the joint of the limestone courses, and he felt the finality of the placement. The stone was home. It was a bridge of mineral strength that would hold the lining firm for generations. He used his chisel to dress the edges of the binder, ensuring that it fit perfectly within the curve of the circle. The sound of the metal against the stone was a high and rhythmic psalm, a melody of the masonry that echoed through the cloister. The physical toll of the work in the shaft was starting to settle into his joints, but Julian did not allow the fatigue to distract him. He focused on the steady flow of his own breath and the rhythmic movement of the bucket. He was the engine of the restoration, and his body was the anchor of the project. He felt the pull in his thighs and the heavy ache in his lower back, and he welcomed the sensation. It was the evidence of his presence in the center of the work. He was giving his own vitality to the mountain, and in return the mountain was giving him the sense of permanence. He placed the second binder, and he watched as the ring of the shaft rose another 6 inches. As the evening approached, the air in the well became colder, and the sound of the evening bell began to toll from the high tower of the Abbey. Julian stood in the center of the well, and he looked at the progress of the day. He had built 5 courses of the limestone lining, and the circle was true, and the bond was solid. He was now nearly 10 feet below the surface of the cloister, and the walls of the shaft were a dark and powerful ridge of earth and stone. He felt the stillness of the Abbey wrapping around him like a familiar garment, and he allowed the quietude to settle into his heart. He thought about the water that would eventually fill this shaft, and the way it would provide the refreshment for the brothers of the next century. He was not just building a well, he was participating in the long and unbroken history of the Abbey. He felt the presence of the masters who had come before him, and he felt the promise of the masters who were yet to be born. The stone was the silent witness to the passage of time, and the well was the vessel of the lifeblood. He reached out, and he touched the limestone wall, and he felt the vibration of the mountains still lingering in the grain. He was at peace. The work was difficult, and the environment was harsh, but the spirit of the masonry was true. He gathered his tools and he prepared for the final climb of the day. He looked at the limestone lining, and he saw the way the light of the first stars was reflecting in the water below. The mountain was at rest, and the stones were still, and the well was finding its permanent form. Julian was tired, and his robes were stained with the gray dust of the limestone and the dark silt of the mountain, but he was satisfied. He was the keeper of the foundation, and he had done his duty. He climbed out of the shaft, and he stood on the damp grass of the cloister, feeling the warmth of the evening air against his skin. The wind had died down, and the air was perfectly still, and the only sound was the distant sighing of the pine trees. Julian took a final look at the circle in the earth, and he saw the silver reflection of the sky and the water. He was leaving the well in the hands of the night, and he knew that the stones were ready for the watch. He walked toward the Abbey entrance, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence in the growing dusk. He was the mason, and the mountain was his master, and in the center of the stone he found his ultimate peace. The first stars were now visible through the intricate stone tracery of the cloister arches, and the air was filled with the cool and fragrant scent of the night-blooming jasmine. Elder Julian reached for the final rung of the wooden ladder, and he pulled himself out of the dark throat of the well. The transition from the subterranean dampness to the open air of the Abbey was a sudden and sensory revelation. He stood on the damp grass, and he felt the immense and open sky above him and the steady and reliable ground beneath his feet. His robes were heavy with the moisture of the aquifer, and his skin was stained with the dark silt of the mountain, but he did not feel the cold. He felt the warmth of the achievement, and the quiet and profound satisfaction of the completed lining. The final task of the masonry was the placement of the curved stone. This was the massive and singular ring of gray granite that would sit at the very top of the shaft and provide the threshold between the world of the light and the world of the water. It was the crown of the well, and it was the protector of the spirit. Julian moved to the edge of the cloister where the granite ring was resting on a bed of soft sand. The stone was nearly 5 feet in diameter and several inches thick, and it had been carved from a single block of the mountain bone during the previous season. The surface was smooth and polished, and it carried the fine and silver grain of the granite. He gathered his tripod and his heavy iron pulley, and he began the process of the final lift. He moved with a quiet and rhythmic grace, and his breath was a slow and constant sound in the silence of the night. He worked by the light of the moon and the soft glow of the Abbey lanterns, and he felt the presence of the mountain all around him. He lashed the oak poles together, and he threaded the hemp rope through the iron sheaves, and he felt the vibration of the machine as it found its balance. This was the most delicate lift of the entire project, for the curved stone had to be perfectly centered over the shaft to ensure the stability of the upper well house. Julian used 4 wide canvas straps to cradle the granite ring, and he took up the slack in the hoisting rope. He leaned his mass into the pull, and he felt the immense weight of the stone as it left the sand. The granite moved with a slow and majestic dignity, and it looked like a silver moon ascending toward the sky. Julian did not look at the stone. He kept his eyes on the ground and his focus on the tension in the rope. He was the anchor, and he was the engine of the ritual. He felt the pull in his core and the heavy ache in his shoulders, and he welcomed the fatigue. It was the evidence of his commitment to the heart of the Abbey. When the curved stone was suspended over the mouth of the well, Julian stopped the lift. He moved to the edge of the shaft, and he reached out a hand to steady the granite. The stone was cold and solid, and it carried the vibration of the lift within its grain. He began the process of the final leveling. He used a series of lead shims to adjust the height of the stone, ensuring that the surface was perfectly horizontal. He checked the level with a shallow bowl of water, and he watched as the liquid settled into a still and perfect mirror. He felt a quiet spark of satisfaction in his chest. The threshold was true, and the masonry was solid, and the well was finally sealed against the mountain. Once the curved stone was settled, Julian removed the straps and the tripod, and he stood alone at the rim of the well. He took a small wooden bucket made of aged cedar, and he tied it to a fresh length of hemp rope. He began the ritual of the first drop. He lowered the bucket into the dark and narrow shaft, and he listened to the sound of the rope as it traveled over the granite edge. The bucket descended through the layers of the history he had built, passing the limestone lining and the basalt intake and the silver floor of the filter bed. He heard the splash as the wood met the water, and the sound was a short and hollow report that echoed through the cloister like a whispered greeting. He pulled the rope back with a steady and rhythmic motion, and he felt the weight of the water as it rose toward the light. When the bucket reached the surface, Julian caught it with a practiced ease, and he set it on the polished granite of the curved stone. The water was clear and cold, and it carried the reflection of the stars in its dark and silver center. Julian reached down, and he dipped his cupped hands into the bucket. The water was the coldest and purest thing he had ever felt, and it carried the sharp and mineral essence of the deep earth. He brought the water to his lips, and he drank. It was a moment of profound communion. He was tasting the lifeblood of the mountain, and he was witnessing the success of the restoration. He stood in the center of the cloister, and he allowed the silence of the night to wrap around him. He thought about the brothers who would come to this well in the mornings to follow, and the way the water would provide the refreshment for the gardens and the kitchens and the cells. He was not just a builder of walls, he was a keeper of the spring. He felt a deep sense of belonging to the Abbey, and he felt the presence of the earth as a companion in the labor. The well was a testament to the patience of the spirit and the honesty of the masonry. It was a bridge of stone and a vessel of water, and it was a permanent anchor in the center of the quietude. Julian gathered his tools, and he cleaned them with a slow and meticulous care. He oiled the steel of his chisels, and he wiped the handles of his hammers, and he coiled the ropes into perfect and overlapping loops. He moved with the quiet intensity of a man who was finishing a prayer. He checked the curved stone one last time, feeling the smooth surface of the granite beneath his dark palms. The work was complete, and the site was clean, and the well was ready for the watch. He felt the fatigue of the day settling into his joints, and the warmth of the evening air against his skin, and he knew that it was time for the rest. He walked toward his cell, and his footsteps were a soft and rhythmic cadence on the damp grass. He entered the small and sparse room, and he felt the cooling presence of the granite walls. He did not light a candle. He moved through the darkness with the familiarity of a man who lived within the stone, and he felt the immense and grounding weight of the Abbey pressing in on him. He removed his damp robes, and he dried his skin with a rough linen cloth. He felt the texture of the fabric against his knuckles and his palms, and he welcomed the sensation of the cleanliness. He was a man of the earth, but he was also a man of the spirit, and the ritual of the washing was a way of returning to his own center. He lay back on the straw pallet, and he pulled the heavy wool blanket up to his shoulders. The straw rustled beneath him with a sound like the dry grass of the high quarry, and the smell of the wool was a comforting and familiar presence. He closed his eyes and he felt the vibration of the mountain still lingering in the marrow of his bones. He saw the circle of the well and the reflection of the stars and the rising of the water. He was the mason of the mountain bone, and he was rooted in the heart of the Abbey. The foundation was secure and the masonry was true, and the builder was finally ready to let go of the day. The darkness in the cell was absolute, and the world outside was a distant and forgotten memory. Julian felt his heartbeat slowing to match the pulse of the mountain, and his breath becoming a low and constant whisper in quietude. He was drifting into the deep and ancient rest of the mineral kingdom. He was the stone, and he was the water, and he was the silence. The ritual of the season was done, and the heart of the Abbey was restored, and the night was holding the watch. And in that quietude he slept.